We have the significant economic presence, which is a way of creating tax nexus in respect of entities that are transacting business in a jurisdiction remotely. And countries that are practicing this includes Nigeria and India. Withholding tax is a deduction of tax on gross basis, which is a very common global tax administrative tool for collecting taxes of certain businesses. Equalization levy is a levy that is also imposed on gross revenue. It works closely like withholding tax, and this was practiced in India. And then, lastly, we have the digital services tax, which is tax imposed on the revenue of the company that provides digital services. And we have quite a number of European countries, including Hungary, UK, France. And then in Africa, we have Kenya that has a GST. Now, if we do a comparison of unilateral measures and multilateral approach, we can see that where we adopt unilateral actions, we are able to assert tax sovereignty, and I know that tax itself is a token of sovereignty. Flexibility, because you can decide within your jurisdiction what you want to do. Speed, you can move at your own speed. I mean, as long as your parliament is able to pass the relevant legislations, you are on the go, unlike when you engage in multilateral discussions that could drag on. Then you could have your policies tailored to your own economic situations, in which case you don't have to consider what happens in other countries. You are able to have your own peculiar solution for your own peculiar situation. And of course, you will have simplicity of administration. Howbeit, if you look at the multilateral approach, if you adopt that, that gives you a measured and targeted rules that will promote innovation. So in which case, the action of one jurisdiction will not negatively impact on another jurisdiction. There will be global acceptance, in which case it will become easy for companies to comply because the rules will be universal. It will create a much more favorable environment for investment and economic development because then the issue of stumbling block of double taxation and all of that will not be there. There will be tax certainty, in which case that will reduce disputes, tax disputes, and of course it helps to eliminate retaliatory trade wars. I mean, we can see what happened between the US and the France some months ago, and then of course issue of tax competition will also be eliminated. These are the positive sides of either the unilateral measure or the multilateral measure. Of course, there are also challenges which are also attributable to each of the approaches. For example, if you do your GST on gross basis, you may actually be overburdening companies, particularly those who are in loss position. You may also have increased cost of compliance because then if each jurisdiction imposes its own unilateral measure, then the companies will have to answer in every of those jurisdictions, and that would increase cost of compliance. And of course, it may also undermine the growth of investment and competitive advantage globally. But for multilateral approach, the challenges there are some of them we have experienced in the inclusive framework, which includes difficulty in reaching consensus, and you can see that the inclusive framework couldn't reach a consensus. Difficulty in getting fair deal for all. I can tell you that most African countries and other developing countries are very, very unhappy. And I dare to say some feel shortchanged in the agreement that was published a few days ago. I have heard Pascal talking about the gains to developing countries, and I also heard Anthony mentioning some of them. But I think the truth has to be told. The truth is that there's little or no money coming from either Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 to developing countries. We shouldn't deceive ourselves. The numbers are there to attest to that. I listened to the first speaker talking about what a number of companies that I think about 89 of them in Kenya under its unilateral measure, whereas only 11 under the multilateral measure. In Nigeria, they are less than 10. We actually have 6 of them that are in Nigeria. On the issue of SCTR being a minimum standard, I am sorry. I think I would disagree with both Anthony and Pastor, because my understanding of minimum standard is that it is applicable to everyone. But the SCTR, as the way it is designed, only applies between developing countries and some countries that are deemed to have effective tax rate that is less than the minimum tax. It does not include countries in Europe, or the US, or the big countries. So that cannot be a minimum standard. I mean, I have my own understanding of minimum standard. So essentially, what you see is that most developing countries actually felt shortchanged by the agreement that came. And of course, we also saw that part of the challenges you may have in a multilateral approach is that small jurisdictions are afraid to talk. And that is the truth. And I personally experienced that when some colleagues from smaller jurisdictions were approaching me. They say, please, can you help us say this, because we dare not say it here. So these are some of the challenges that come with multilateral approach. But then Nigeria didn't join, just like Kenya didn't join. It wasn't a team up, it wasn't a gang up between Nigeria and Kenya. It was because for Nigeria, we have issues which we have made clearly to the inclusive framework, but which were largely ignored. For example, we have issues with mandatory binding dispute resolution because our constitution wouldn't allow us to do that. We have issues and concerns about the expansive definition given to multilateral measure, unilateral measure, my apologies, which we encroach into our traditional normal action right, which has nothing to do with DST. So we have articulated all our issues which we have made known to the inclusive framework, but unfortunately they were not accommodated. Now, without doubt, I mean, looking at the advantages or the merits of each of the two approaches, I mean, the overwhelming support theoretically will be for multilateral approach. But then we need to ask ourselves the question: how come Nigeria didn't join? How come Kenya didn't join? How come some other countries are not joining? I mean, Ghana is not really a member of the inclusive framework. What we have seen in the negotiations that led to the publication of the statement we had a few days ago was one. I mean, when we started this project in 2018, it was very clear that the project was to go and look for solution to privatization of the digitalized economy. But then that changed because one of the countries said, no, it has to be for all businesses. Number two is that when we were going into that project, all countries were supposed to go on the principle of equal footing. And my understanding of equal footing is not just equal right to sit at the table, but equal rights to have your views considered objectively. And if indeed your view is the right view objectively, it should be adopted. And if not, it should be rejected, notwithstanding whether you are a developing economy or you are a developed economy. But we can see that this, in my view, was not so in the course of the negotiations. Some countries were considered super countries, so whatever they say is law. And some countries, no matter how genuine their issues are never get on board. We have made. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Have I overstayed my?
No, you've got 2 more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Now, major decisions in the inclusive framework actually moved to the steering group, and therefore, and steering group have only 24 members, and we have inclusive framework member of 140. And so, when we have the inclusive framework meeting, it's more or less to just adopt what has happened in the steering group with little or no debate. Then, of course, during the debates, sanctions were used as, threats of sanctions were used to want to whip people into line. Even as small as the steering group was sharply divided, which was why the final document that came, which the inclusive framework adopted, was not even the steering group document. It was chairman's document, and that says the level of disagreement even within the steering group. And then, of course, what do we mean by consensus? My simple understanding of consensus is that everybody goes along, or there's no disagreement. But that is not true of what happened. So these are some of the things that went wrong with the inclusive framework statement, and which was why some countries, even though participated, even though members of the steering group could not join the statement. But then let's talk to ourselves as Africans, as developing countries. What went wrong with us? Because sincerely, a lot went wrong with us in developing countries in this negotiation. We have 25% of total membership of the inclusive framework. So how come we couldn't make significant impact or influence? Number one reason is because our political leaders were aloof in the process. While the G20 presidents, head of government were actively discussing the tax issue, the discussion at the inclusive framework, there was something at a time I had AU, the president of African countries, discussing anything about this. So we were very aloof. Number two is that many of the developing countries that were participating in the inclusive framework discussions, we didn't put there our best brains. I don't know what, how we got the people we sent there. We didn't put our best forward. And that is, I'm sorry, we need to talk to ourselves very, very, very clearly and see what went wrong with us. Number three is that the cumulative effect of severe failures in our tax administration are manifested in our ability to negotiate effectively. And of course, we were very naive. We were very, very naive because we took everything hook, line, and sinker, and we didn't think out of the box during the negotiation. And why we are able to get what we got in this case. Now, all of this are already known. I mean, the issues have been discussed why we couldn't join and consign the developing countries for Pillar 1 or Pillar 2. Since my time is gone, I won't go there. But permit me to just spend 1 minute here, and then I'll get out of your way. Is this the end of the road for me? No, it's not the end of the road. We must continue to engage in the process, and I love what Marcio said. What we are discussing is not a project that has a terminal end. No, it is a continuum. And so Nigeria, Kenya, all other African countries, we must continue to get involved in the process. We must not disengage. Number two is that we need to sharpen our capacity for tax policy and administration. I mean, we must first of all get our houses in order. And then we can then go out there and then we can talk like peers with our colleagues when we meet out there. We must invest in technology, particularly for our tax administration. Today, big data is the issue. We must begin to invest in technology to get data and to use them for our tax administration. And then, in future negotiations, in future tax discussions, our political leaders our diplomatic assets must be deployed. We saw what happened. I mean, not everything we can discuss openly, but we knew what happened. Most of the 136 countries that joined because there were political pressure, there were diplomatic pressure. And then, very importantly, those countries that are looking at developing specific unilateral measures must be careful to ensure that such measures will not impede trade, will not be seen as being targeting a specific country. And then, very importantly, as developing countries, particularly as African, under ATA, can we begin to work on alternatives? What other options, apart from what we have on the table, can work for us? Finally, permit me to share a thought from late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, if this means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated and segregated, then that's the kind of peace that I don't want. And for Africa, thank you and God bless you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Godwin, for your very passionate, very candid opinions and general remarks. We have had you, sir. Thank you very much. Please stay online. Our panelists, please also stay online. I have received a few questions from our online community. Please remember, do not just raise your hands. If you're joining us on Zoom, kindly go to the chat box and place your question there. Before I go to the online questions, do I have any questions from the floor? All right. Can I kindly get a microphone to the gentleman at the top right? Please let us know your name and your question quickly. A microphone is coming to you. And I'm sure it's sanitized as well. All right, there we go.
Good morning.
Kindly speak up. Put up
Good
the mic.
morning. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, members of the board, direct fraternity, and our business partners. My question will be directed to Commissioner Dr. Saidimu and Mr. Munanda. We are talking about digital taxation, and in customs, we have a revolution of 3D printing. We have issues where manufacturing has now shifted to people who are at home. We are seeing processes, at least I have watched documentaries where people are able to print commodities from their houses. You can imagine when we have manufacturers who transform, or even, let's say, auto dealers who are able to print automotive parts and sell to consumers. My question then will be, are we looking at having a 3D printing tax strategy to ensure that we do not have revenue leakage? And then when we go there, how do we classify such businesses? Is it manufacturing or is it a business? How do we treat the taxation of the same? How do we look at issues of transfer pricing? Where is value accrued? Is it when we print, or is it when the manufacturer has received a digital file, what we call intangible value? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Dr. Saidimu, would you like to address that? And then I'll ask Mr. Munanda as well to give a quick comment.
All right. Thank you again. Just to rephrase, I'm not too sure whether I understood, but you're asking whether change of manufacturing from physical manufacturing to online representation of manufacturing is taxable, and how do we go about taxing it? Is that right?
And if it represents a revenue leakage?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. The current discussion on digital taxation is two-faced. One of them is completely automated processes, which is the transfer of data, maximization of use of data for tax purposes. And the second one is customer facing, where we do product selling, products buying through online. In terms of the unilateral measures that have been taken, is that taxation of system or technology facilitated trade, we tax commission on it based on the commission that you earn. But in terms of automated services, we tax the actual gross value of the transaction itself, that is on the DST. In terms of the unilateral agreed position, is that all these online technology, automated assisted production, whether defined as manufacturing or not, is consolidated as one single entity in the country of origin or the country of parent country, and then all their revenue are classified as revenue generated by that particular company. Once it's consolidated, they look at the criteria I've given earlier, the turnover 20 billion, the country-based market generation of 1 million euros, and then if it meets all those criteria, then they look at which country contributed on what, because each and every country is associated to a certain level of turnover generation. The question there lies is, how do you, for example, in terms of customs and international trade, how do you associate the importation of consolidated goods, for example, in Dubai, that is destined to Kenya, but the Microsoft, for example, distribution of licenses is imported to Dubai or Qatar and then transferred to Kenya. So the ultimate consumer is Kenya, but the actual importers are in Dubai. So the general benefit of such, according to the newly agreed position, will go to Dubai. So Dubai will benefit in terms of amount A that is meant to come to Kenya. So there's a lot of discussions that we need to do and agree in terms of agreeing to the final decision. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Saidino. Mr. Munanda, are you online? Did you get the question? Or quick
Yes,
comment? I'll address to you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for opportunity to respond to that question. But before I address that, I want to just go briefly to what my brother Matthew Tubula talked about what went wrong. I think that's a fundamental observation you made there, and I think it actually was overlooked in my comments, and because something we've consistently requested our African delegates and the whole political class to support this global debate. So I think without repeating myself to all the things he said, I think we need to take that point quite heavy as a way forward. There is need to relook at how we can effectively participate from a technical and from a political perspective. Coming back to the particular question in front of us, I think Dr. Saidin has gone straight to the issue. This question looked at the digital transformation. Now, not a physical plant in Nairobi doing manufacturing of maybe some digital documents, but rather maybe a company or maybe a group of persons might be using platforms or maybe other technology to do that printing at the comfort of their home. So we are looking at how can the new rules address that position. First and foremost, it's good to ask ourselves whether that transaction is purely homegrown. Is it a transaction by a pure Kenyan company? And if so, already that company has got physical presence in the jurisdiction, and therefore any income that company generates should be largely be taxed from your jurisdiction, either through the normal corporate tax regime or the DST framework. But if that company is a part of the national enterprise, as of course Dr. Saidino explained, then we have to look at whether the current framework brings that company into scope of the rules. And if it is brought into the scope, then we've got to ask whether the revenue is sourced from Kenya. And the revenue rules are looking at where is the place of the final consumption for those goods which have been maybe manufactured and distributed through a digital platform. And if the revenue sourcing rules, as they will finally be designed, shows that the place of consumption of that technology is actually in Kenya, then Kenya will be eligible for reallocation of taxing rights. So there are several steps there. One is the company in scope, and there are scope rules about the threshold, the levels of profitability. Then after that, you go to look at the nexus rules, which is a whole range of complex analysis to see whether effectively that's a jurisdiction where the revenue is sourced from. If yes, then there will be allocation of taxing right. Is there a problem? Okay, so there will be a problem if the company is domestic and is not being taxed, then there should be domestic laws to address that. But if it's purely digital transformation, then potentially there is a gap because of the current rules if the company is not going to be in scope. Is that good or bad for the countries at large? I think we also need to look at what are other benefits of digitalization. Is it potentially creating other economic transformation besides tax? So there's a whole range of issues to be analyzed there before you make the ultimate judgment call of either economic policy or tax policy to deal with that kind of a transaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Munada. If you could just stay online. I have a joint question for you from our online community, for you and for Mr. Verdi from SIAD and Mr. Ben Dixon from OECD. I see you there. So I have a joint question for you, and the question is, how do we address the magnitude or the impact in loss of revenue by developing countries as argued in the adoption of these approaches? Maybe Ben Dixon, you could start because we've not had your voice yet. Then he could be followed by Mr. Verdi and then Mr. Munanda.
Yes, good morning everybody and distinguished guests. And Pascal apologises that he's now in fact on an aeroplane, so I'm delighted to be able to take any questions that might have been directed at him. If I've understood correctly, the question is about revenue loss derived from the recent agreements. Am I right?
Yes.
Let me maybe frame that question in a broader comment about what has been said by others, because I think this strikes at the heart of the Kenya issue about whether the two-pillar solution that Kenya is yet to join really does deliver additional revenues or not, compared to the revenues derived from a digital service tax or other measures. And I think I would like to say that there are tens of millions of dollars at stake for Kenya and other African countries. And I do take issue a bit with what Matthew said. I mean, Matthew actually presented a balanced picture of the process, but I think in terms of revenues, it is clear from our analysis, and Dr. Saidu will confirm that my team and his spent 4 or 5 hours last week going through the numbers, and we continue to stand by to keep the dialogue up, of course, but it is clear to us that there are significant revenue gains to Kenya from the two-pillar solution. Now, you may not want to take my word for it, or you may not want to take Matthew's word for it, or you may not want to take any individual's word for it who is clearly a stakeholder in this process. But there is some independent research just out from academics which concludes on the African continent that revenues derived from the two-pillar solution in the agreed by the inclusive framework last week, 136 countries, is double the amount of digital service tax revenues derived on the basis of a 2 to 3% tax in all African countries. So I'm just putting that on the table, but I think it is misleading to see this process as not delivering revenues for Africa and developing countries. And after all, that is, at the end of the day, that actually is what matters most. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Verdi?
Yes. Well, first, I'd like to congratulate Anthony and Matthews and Pascal, great presentations. And I'll try to have another vision, maybe to complement what Ben mentioned. I think, of course, this week we are always looking for the hot topics of the month. Is Action 1, Pillar 1, Pillar 2. I think we should look for, I tried to do this on my presentation, look for BEPS as a whole. We have 15 actions, no? For, in my opinion, Action 8, 9, and 10 on transfer price and 13 will be more important for many Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, Africa, maybe than Action 1. Because Action 1, I don't feel comfortable to answer because we need to have more details about the Part A, the Part B of Pillar 1, and the Pillar 2. It depends, because we live in a very, of course, the countries are different. If maybe the Pillar 2 will give the biggest impact will be for rich countries because they have the headquarters of the big companies. But this, I'm not saying that it will not be important to African countries, but this is a process. I think there are other actions that we can use immediately with a great response in favor of all countries, like to control the team capitalization, the control of abuse of interest, the transfer pricing, the abuse of treatments. So for me, BEPS is much bigger than Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. That's my point. Of course, I support Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. But this is a process. Maybe the result we will have in 5 years, because only in 2024 we will have a better perspective of the impact of the measures. So I think maybe it's too early to have a final position, because just to conclude, in many cases we are discussing if the right level should be 15, 20, 25. I'm not sure if we increase the minimum rate, it will generate a huge impact in a country if the country has no multilateral companies with branches on abroad. Maybe the result will be the same. So I think we need to look at the total measures of the BEPS program. And regarding the Action 1 and 2, I think we have to work on the details of Pillar A, try to have a clear roads. If the result will be very complex, it will be very difficult to implement. I think we need to try to find a simple way to calculate Pillar A, Part A and B of the Pillar 1, for example.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verdi. Mr. Munanda, can I repeat the question for you? Are you okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the question was, how do we address the magnitude or the impact in loss of revenue by developing countries as argued in adoption of these approaches?
All right. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's all clear about revenue impact in this proposal. I think as a starting point, we have to look at the reality on the ground. So the reality on the ground is that businesses have become highly digitalized. Others have become extremely profitable by using intangibles and the current rules have got weaknesses to tax effectively those kind of revenue streams. That's the starting point. So the question is, are countries able to tax these companies under the current framework? The answer to that question is no, unless the country has got large measures which are effective. So if currently countries are not able to tax maybe Netflix, Booking.com, maybe Apple, it means there's a revenue gap at the moment. With the countries gain from the new rules, that's a reality again by checking, is there any profits available for reallocation under the current design? And therefore that requires us to look at whether those profits are there. So what ETAF has done independently is to go to commercial databases and other information sources to establish how much is really available. Is there any profits available for redistribution? And we can see that close to 100 billion of these kind of profits are actually available for reallocation. OECD, from their publication, they have even a much higher figure, but from our analysis, close to 100 billion. So there is a reality that there is profits to be reallocated. The next reality check, would there any profits allocated to a jurisdiction so that they can increase their taxes? That's a practical question which requires a country such as Kenya to look at the real numbers based on the data perhaps they get from OECD on how much the profits will be allocated. That requires additional data sets, which is about whether there will be nexus sufficient for profits to be allocated. And if the data shows practically there is additional profit, then the next reality is confirmed. How much of it? That perhaps becomes a great concern. So if it's only a small proportion and DSTO is giving you significantly more, then you got maybe a concern there to raise. And I think from our comments, we say those concerns need to be looked at. And as ETAF, we indicated that the allocable profits is not really sufficient to address the current gaps in allocation of taxing rights. That's why that allocation should have been slightly higher. But is there any profits being allocated? Is there additional revenue impact? I think that's the primary consideration countries need to confront with and of course evaluate. I think from a very simplistic perspective, there will be some profits being allocated to jurisdictions such as Kenya, where already highly digitalized businesses have got some virtual presence. There will be profits. How much of it? I think I agree with Marshall. Perhaps it's too early to measure that. I think the implementation timeline will be critical to answer that question with real numbers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your responses. Panelists, I would like to ask one last question. I see we're running out of time. But I have a question for you, Mr. Godumbola, from the members of the audience. And I think this is a joint response from you and from Dr. Saidimo, and I think also Mr. Ben Dixon as well. And yeah, so the question is, are the frameworks biased in favor of developed countries only? So I think they mean the inclusive framework, the multilateral. I would think that's what they're asking. Are the frameworks biased in favor of developed countries only? Mr. Kotumbula, still online? Want to take the question?
Yes, I'm online. Thanks very much, moderator. I wouldn't want to use the word bias as indicated in that question. I would rather say that the outcome of that statement did not let me say, did not take cognizance of peculiarities of developing countries. And therefore, some of the measures that have been put in place actually are not working in favor of developing countries. For example, if you take the issue of scope, out of about 100 countries, companies that are in scope based on the turnover of 20 billion euro and 10% profitability, less than 10 companies actually are going to be giving harm of aid to Nigeria. So what happens to the other companies that are actually doing business in Nigeria, for example, Uber or Facebook or any of those other digital services companies? Meanwhile, the domestic companies that are doing similar businesses are paying taxes. I think that is the question. If you take the issue of mandatory binding arbitration, for example, and looking at the costs of doing that, because even in the discussions at the working parties, the mandatory dispute resolution is not free. I mean, you have to pay some fee for you to participate, to take your cases there. And so, and the kind of money that is being mentioned may be very small in the terms of developed economies. I mean, for example, $50,000 is very small on the street of New York. But I can tell you $50,000 is very big in Lagos, in Nigeria. So, and when you look at the tax disputes that are coming, it means for me in Nigeria, for example, for me to be able to, if I have to spend $50,000, for example, on a case, the tax in dispute cannot be less than $3 to $4 million. But then you and I know that you hardly get such tax disputes in developing countries. So those are the issues. The issues of nexus. I mean, just like the commissioner articulated in his first point, if there are 89 companies already in scope under the domestic rule, now it's going to reduce to 11. Then those are the issues that are actually the concerns of developing countries. So it's not a matter of bias. It's just the fact that when the decisions were reached, it did not take into cognizance the situations of developing countries which we are supposed to be negotiating on equal. Thank you.
So in a very quick one word, Mr. Kotumbula, if you were to be asked if this frameworks favor the global south, so to speak, your answer would be yes or no?
I would say that it's not a matter of favor. I mean,
okay.
I want to be very specific. It's not a favor. It's a matter, I mean, we are talking about equal footing. Equal footing means you come, I come, you put yours on the table, I put mine on the table, okay. And then we look at objectively what works. And that's my understanding of that. But the outcome then, therefore, will be fair to all.
All right.
But what we have seen is the fact that the situations that developing countries put on the table were not are reflected in the final agreement. That's actually the issue. So it's not a matter of favor or bias.
It is equal footing.
Exactly.
All right, thank you. Before we go to SIAT, let's have Dr. Saitimo.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the question. Maybe as Kojimbo has also answered, I would like to tweak it a bit,
okay,
and look at it in terms of certainty instead of biasness.
Okay.
So what we look at in terms of developing countries, Africa, most of the African nations involved, is that what is the reliability, what is the certainty of tax restructuring? Because this agreement includes not only the digital economies, I mean digital firms, but also the other multinationals that are operating with through the normal manufacturing. You know, the moment you're out of scope and you'd like to be out of scope completely, then you just need to restructure and operate without a PE. So the permanent establishment then moves from Kenya to another, to the parent country, and that means you're out of scope. You know, that is one of the issues that we did not consider. Number two is also the predictability of the profits. We expect that the jurisdictions where the parent companies are would prepare the accounts, make the requirements for the nexus rules, and then again they disclose those particular accounts for all of us to see our share of profits. That uncertainty is also what we could also see. This agreement is supposed to stay in place for the next 7 years. So it means once we get into agreement, there is no renegotiation of the company's scope, the nexus rules, and any other rules that is related to this agreement until the end of 7 years. And finally, Kenya, just like any other developing countries, would like to have every shilling that is generated in Kenya and in Kenya taxed, just like any other domestic companies. And for that reason, the agreement also includes a paragraph or a provision that cost of compliance shall be retained at minimum. And that means what my colleague from Nigeria is saying, the $50,000 in Lagos, would mean that such a small amount will not be subjected to a review and shall not be, the cost of carrying out an audit for that particular amount should be kept at minimum and should not even be considered. So those are the issues that we are raising in terms of the developing nation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Saidimu. I would like to ask Mr. Ben Dixon the same question. Mr. Kojambula has tweaked the question, Dr. Saidimu has tweaked the question, but I will pose the same question to you, Mr. Dixon, because this is what the delegate has asked. How do we, where's the question? How will, oh, my question has disappeared. Are the frameworks biased in favor of developed countries only? Mr. Ben Dixon from OECD.
Yeah, thank you. You know, they say that a good deal happens when nobody is happy. What you get in the recent negotiations is precisely that. So if you take, for example, how much quantum, how much profit would be reallocated to the new taxing rate, and the percentages. Well, you had countries arguing for 0, you had countries arguing for 35 or 40. And in the end, we ended up with 25. So everything at this level of politics where fiscal pressures are so intense because of the COVID crisis and so on, there is always going to be a compromise. And what you've ended up with, I think, is what you would expect, which is a reasonable compromise for all parties. But I think you've got to see this in historical context. These rules have not been looked at properly for 100 years. And what we saw last week is the beginning, not the end, of a new era which sees a brand new way of allocating taxing rights. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would like very much to support what Anthony has said earlier, is that Africa in particular has had a massive impact on these negotiations and has won victories where, frankly, we never would have thought possible. And that is a sea change in the way in which the international tax rules have been made over recent years. So I think overall, nothing is perfect, nobody's happy entirely, but I think there is a reasonable deal for developing countries. And at the end of the day, as we said earlier, what this is about is revenue. And there is no question in my mind that over time, as these new rules bed down, there will be greater gains for market jurisdictions. And as profit shifting ceases by big companies, there will be revenue gains there. And as Dr. Saidimu has said, that the threshold will be revisited. Okay, maybe it's not soon enough for many countries, but it will be revisited. And more companies will come in scope, and more revenue will be available to developing countries. It seems to me to be inevitable. So that is my that's my answer to the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ben Dixon. And finally, Mr. Verdi, I can repeat the question for you. Are the frameworks biased in favor of developed countries only?
I don't think so. I think maybe it's too early to know. What I think, what for me is clear, that when we think about digital economy and the service done by a company without a permanent establishment, like Netflix, Spotify, this large number of companies. Remember, we are discussing if the part A should be 25%, 20%. It's okay, it's very important. But we can start collecting consumption tax right now. So while we wait for this discussion that will define the amount for income tax, the additional that we will share among countries, don't waste time, and we should work hard in order to start collecting the VAT on all this service. In our countries, VAT is the biggest country. We are lost in tax base because we are not collecting. Just to give you an example, in Chile, they approve a legislation, they start collecting VAT on digital economy. They receive in a voluntary base a registration of 200 companies, and they haven't collected $200 million in 8 months in the first year, $200 million. So I think when we look for digital economy, let's start collecting. We don't have to wait until we solve this problem for income tax to start collecting consumption tax and excise tax. Regarding to the Pillar 1, I think what we have done is great. We have to celebrate, and we have to applaud all the participants and all the people that are working very hard in achieve this result. But now, if we'll see in 2 or 3 or 5 years the amount that each country will receive, and if it's not fair, we should present the voice and say, hey guys, we need to review this amount. I think it's, again, for me, it's too early to have a final position regarding the income tax. But we don't have to wait to start collecting the consumption tax on digital economy. Thank you very much for this opportunity for me and for Francisco. Now here is 20 past 4 a.m. So
Oh,
we have a
wow.
great time. And I have another conference at 8.
Oh, wow.
Here, so
You got a load.
time to take a coffee. Thank you very much.
Okay, before you take your coffee, Mr. Verdi, please give us your closing remarks, and then we can let you off to take a short nap and then your coffee as well.
Very short.
Yes, very
when we discuss tax administration, we know it's very difficult, very operative actions, but when we are discussing about tax policy, for me, it's very short. Tax policy is not an event. It's a process, and it's a very difficult process. So it's very difficult to get a consensus in a world basis. So we need to be very optimistic. We are working in a good direction. We are doing a good job. What we need is to keep working together, explain the reasons, discussing, using data, because I'm sure that what we have achieved, as I said when I did my presentation, is amazing. I have 44 years working in the public finance, and more than 30 on taxation. What we have achieved in the last 15, I could never thought. So I think I'm very optimistic. I think we are in a good path. And thank you very much again for this opportunity.
A warm round of applause, please, for Mr. Verdi. We have to let him go because he needs to go get some coffee and prepare for his next meeting. Thank you. Ciao.
Congratulations, sir.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate. Take our greetings to your people, and we wish you all the best. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for participating in your questions and answers. Unfortunately, your questions rather, unfortunately, we were unable to respond to all of them, but I think we covered some good ground. So thank you to our online community as well for sending in your questions. I believe our panel session is almost done, but before we wrap it up, we want to request for closing remarks from our panelists. Maybe we start with Mr. Ben Dixon from OECD. Mr. Dixon, if you could hear me, kindly give us your brief closing remarks.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to participate. It's been really fascinating. I think that there's two things I would say. One is that now the task of implementation begins, and the OECD stands by with our partners to help all countries, particularly developing countries, implement these solutions, and we'll be gearing up our technical support to help with our friends at ATAF and elsewhere. Then the only other thing I wanted to say was that in the case of Kenya, as Pascal said, and the Commissioner General said in his opening remarks, we have much to celebrate in terms of our partnership and our working together. And we stand by to continue and accelerate the dialogue on these difficult and sensitive matters. And I was noting with some pleasure that I see that travel from France to Kenya is now very much a possibility. And me and my team stand by to come at any moment to talk to the Commissioner and his team to keep up the dialogue. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Dixon. Do they say bienvenue? How do you say? Welcome.
Bienvenue.
Bienvenue. Karibuni, Kenya. Welcome very much. All right, thank you. And Mr. Munanda from Pretoria, South Africa. Please give us your closing remarks.
Thank you very much, and I'll start by saying once more, thank you very much to the Commissioner General and Care Management for inviting me. I think the opening remarks I forgot to say, formally a Kenya Revenue employee, and to have participated in this very important and also very glad to have seen Kenya taking position, which the world needs to know. There are certain things which need to be addressed, that is important. But we also are glad that there is open discussion at the inclusive framework. And I think, therefore, that persistent position, I think, needs to be sustained so that countries that remain to have concerns, and we as ETAF also had concern, those issues would be addressed for a better solution, which of course protects countries' tax base, because that's what all these projects is all about. So ultimately, Kenya and other countries indeed should benefit from this project. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Mr. Munanda. I was wondering when you'll ever say and declare that you are former KRA staff. So thank you for representing us there at ATAF, and our greetings to the family at ATAF. Mr. Gojumbula from Abuja, I believe you're in Abuja, Nigeria. Please give us your closing remarks. Passionately, I am expecting. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, Mabuja, moderator, let me congratulate the Commissioner General and KRA for this summit, and I think it was a very brilliant one. I mean, at this time. In closing, just like Nigeria had made up its mind to continue to engage with the inclusive framework and participate in all its work, we want to encourage Kenya to do the same, and all other countries in Africa, because in dialogue, that's when we can move the tax system forward. However, we need to learn from our mistakes. In my part of Nigeria, we have a proverb that says, if a child running on an errand falls down, he picks himself up very quickly and looks forward and starts running. But if an elder walking on the street falls, he looks back and says, why did I fall? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godwin. Always leaving us on a cliffhanger with a very good quote. All right, Dr. Saidimu, please give us your closing remarks.
All right, thank you, Wageni, and thank you, management of KRA and the leadership of Treasury. My closing remarks goes back to what Ben Dickinson said, that we continue to engage. Last week we had 5 hours discussion. Some figures are now coming out. We appreciate figures that were never available before. We anticipate that we're going to agree on some certain agreements in terms of way forward. Of course, the discussion will go around the out-of-scope companies. We still request that we retain the powers to do the DST for the out-of-scope companies. We are also aware that these bilateral discussions between the agreeing countries with the parent jurisdictions to continue having DST. We're also discussing on the same non-binding arbitration because we have an established arbitration process in Kenya. The use of World Bank GNI measurements for the developing countries. And something that was mentioned earlier, the subject to tax rules, which is going to be done bilaterally. So if you pay royalties and you're paying at a lower tax rate to a country that is receiving, we need to have a discussion on something like a minimum tax on all the royalties paid out instead of having a bilateral agreement, because the country receiving has a power to decline that agreement to reduce or to tax, subject to tax rule for the royalties and interest. We had also proposed that we exclude regulated financial institutions in the part of the exclusions, which includes extractive industries. It was the opinion of Kenya that we exclude regulated financial institutions, and also, of course, the general agreement that we need to raise the percentage from 25% to a higher figure of 35 to 50%. Those are my closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saidimu. Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we give our panelists and our keynote speaker a very, very warm appreciation and a warm round of applause. It is now 12:27 East Africa time.
Just recently, we have seen a lot of graft. We have seen corruption in the middle of KPLC, Kenya Power in the country. And very many Kenyans have been affected. Wananchi wa kawaida wanalia. Even us as students, the Kenya University Student Organization, yesterday we gave an ultimatum of 5 days to Kenya Power so that we can have the new task force. That task force has only 5 days to ensure that the culprits, that the people involved in graft. Remember, the president just last week gave a task force which is headed by Bwanagumi, which we expect for them to ensure they are the forefront of ensuring that those culprits are brought to book. Secondly, in the same breath, I want to say that these 5 days that we have given, there are only 4 days left. And our expectation is that within those 4 days, that task force must ensure those names are mentioned, and even the cabinet secretary, or rather, even the government officers who are involved in that corruption, they are also supposed to be brought to book. And we expect, as the Kenya University Student Organization, and we are also expect the next government to be at the forefront of fighting corruption. These people must be taken to jail just like the way the people who stole funds in the sports ministry are in jail currently in committee. That is our expectations as university students, and we are going to fight for justice to ensure that the common mwananchi is not oppressed by the few haves. Remember, the majority of Kenyans are the have-nots. And remember, in a few days, a few months, our president is ending his term. His most iconic and historic legacy will be the fight against corruption. And that is why we are in the forefront of fighting the same.
Agreements between Kenya and Tanzania are res inter aelios actos. They cannot per se affect the maritime boundary between Kenya and Somalia. However, the issue to be considered in the present case is whether the use of an equidistance line produces a cutoff effect for Kenya, not as a result of the agreed boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, but as a result of the configuration of the coastline. If the examination of the coastline is limited only to the coasts of Kenya and Somalia, any concavity is not conspicuous. However, by examining only the coastlines of the two states concerned to assess the extent of any cutoff effect resulting from the geographic configuration of the coastline may be an overly narrow approach. Examining the concavity of the coastline in a broader geographical configuration is consistent with the approach taken by this court and international tribunals. In the two North Sea continental shelf cases, the court examined the coasts of 3 states, with Germany in the middle. The court did so in the context of proceedings that had been joined, although the cases themselves remained separate. The court noted that although 2 separate delimitations were in question, they involved, indeed actually gave rise to, a single situation. The court emphasized that the fact that the question of either of these delimitations might have arisen and called for settlement separately in point of time does not alter the character of the problem with which the court is actually faced. In both the Bangladesh-Myanmar and Bangladesh versus India cases, even though the issue was that of a boundary between the 2 respective states, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the former case and the Arbitral Tribunal in the latter each looked at the concavity of the coast of the 3 states as a whole, with Bangladesh in the middle. In the present case, the potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements should be assessed in a broader geographical context. The potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements cannot be properly observed by examining the coasts of Kenya and Somalia in isolation.
Kenyatta litaka Kenya akafungwa. Asante, asante baba, asante, asante baba, asante, asante baba kwa kufungwa. So then now the country got together. You did not think of us as Kikuyus, Luos, Kambas, Kalenjin, and so on. There's that sense of nationalism. And that is what forced the British to give independence. Otherwise, it would have been like Rhodesia or South Africa. That's unity. And our family became one. You hear me all the time referring to Uhuru as brother. It is not taken from out of the blues. We are brothers. Uhuru's elder sister Margaret used to live in our house here in Jerusalem. The mom is the one who was looking after the family. So we are brothers. Me and Uhuru were brothers. Even if we fight for elections, we just fight.
Because there was anarchy, there was violence, and Kenya was not peaceful at that time. Lakini baba alijihambo, akaenda kwa Uhuru Kenyatta, na President Uhuru Kenyatta pia yeye akajihambo, wakafanya handshake. Congratulations for that. Thank you for demonstrating humility, and thank you for demonstrating that indeed you're committed to having a peaceful Kenya. There are various reasons why we have electoral violence. Number 1 is hate speech. Number 2 is incitement. And number 3 is people who have no respect for diversity and people who have no respect for the choices of other people. Baba, as you do your campaigns, na ninaona Babu Owino ako hapa comrade, mkichapa